Thank you very much. Well, the outline describing this session indicated that the changes sweeping the Arab world are far-reaching, significant for American interests, but largely outside US control or even influence. And then it went on to say that the US policy options seem limited. And I would like to take issue with both these points. Yes, the changes in the Arab world are far-reaching, and they are sweeping, and we have countries of different natures in the Arab world. Countries in transition after mostly peaceful revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, and to some extent Yemen. Countries in violent transition, like Libya. Country in a civil war, Syria. Country facing civil strife, Iraq. Countries trying to achieve change from above, like Morocco, Jordan, and perhaps some countries in the Gulf. Some countries in constant turmoil, Somalia, Sudan, perhaps even Lebanon. And finally, countries that are trying to avoid change altogether, particularly in the Gulf. And perhaps Algeria, that feels that it has already passed through that in the 90s. These changes, and future changes as well, will have a huge impact on the whole region and beyond. Even in the countries that feel that they are trying to be immune from the virus of change, whether in the Gulf, in Turkey, even in Israel. And we've seen changes that are taking place in the last few months and a few weeks. Changes in Iran, demonstrations in Sudan, even developments, unfortunate developments in places like Mali, changes in Iran after the elections, and so on. But all this have made the situation extremely volatile. But I would bet as well that in 5 years' time, this region will be irrecognizable if you compare it to today, let alone if you compare it with the beginning of the Arab awakening. In the few minutes that I have, I want to talk about three issues. The first point is to comment on developments in the Arab world and the US control or influence on these events, and the US policy options, focusing particularly on Syria, Egypt, and the Palestinian question, and finally the road ahead. Developments are beyond the control of the United States, absolutely. They are beyond the control of anybody. And as a matter of fact, the United States, and Joe Biden just said that that the US cannot dictate events, and it is not even seeking to do so, only a few minutes ago. But if I was here a year ago, and I told you in a year's time, Morsi will no longer be president of Egypt, I think you would have thought that I was crazy. And if I was here 2 years ago, and I told you 2 years from now, we will still be suffering from the crisis in Syria, I think you would not have believed me as well. And if I told you a year ago that in a year's time the Palestinians and the Israelis will be sitting around the negotiating table, you would probably think that I was crazy. So this is how volatile the situation is and how fast it is changing. But in order for the US to be influential, I think it has to have the right assessment of the situation in different places around the world in which it is trying to have this influence. And this influence can be of many natures and many ways. For example, the US assessment of the developments in Egypt after the 25th of January 2011 were that the government would be able to control the situation in Egypt. And more recently, after the overthrow of Morsi, it took the administration 3 months in order to come to an assessment close to the situation that is taking place in Egypt.
1 minute.
No, this is unfair. I object. I'm still in the first point.
You can take my time, because I'm going to only speak for a minute.
And this is Arab-Israeli cooperation at its best. Earlier, Tamara said that she was not going to take all her minutes, and she offered to give me some of hers.
I was undisciplined.
Yes, and then, but I will take this offer anyway. So it took the American administration 3 months to come close to an accurate assessment of the situation in Egypt through the statement that was made by President Obama in the General Assembly. And the perception in Egypt was that the US was biased towards the Muslim Brotherhood, and the administration did not exert the necessary effort to explain to the Egyptian people that they are supporting democratic values and democratic principles, and not the Muslim Brotherhood. And they entered into an incoherent debate about whether it's a coup or a revolution. And I won't go into that because of the time limitations, but we can do that in the discussions. And the problem is that we're living in a world of sound bites, where people want quick fixes. It's a coup, it's a revolution. You know, you want to put labels to facilitate things. And then the wrong assessment led to tensions in the relations between Egypt and the United States, and I'm glad it's on its way to be overcome. In Syria, very briefly, as a result of hesitation, the United States administration took one step forward, one step back in relation to what to do with opposition. And then, as a result of the presidential campaign, we stayed 1 year waiting for something to happen from American influence in this issue. And as a matter of fact, nothing took place. Only a few days back, as a result of the Russian initiative, things are moving, and we hope in the right direction. But the fear is that there is a fear that there is a focus on chemical weapons and not on resolving the crisis in Syria. And this is why I'm happy that Joe Biden focused on Geneva II and not only on the destruction of chemical weapons. And in contrast to these two issues, as a result of an accurate assessment of the situation regarding the Palestinian question, the United States was successful in bringing both parties back to the table. So this is why I think assessment is crucial in addressing these issues.
1 minute.
Okay.
I mean it.
Yes. Okay. Now, since I have 1 minute, I have to go to the future. But I'll say one thing about the past, because Tamara mentioned that. I refer to the speech of President Obama in Cairo. People in Egypt and in the Arab world were elated after this speech. I was in the State Department 4 years ago. Tamara was there. And I was discussing with the Undersecretary at the time the implementation of various aspects of this speech. Where are we today? Nowhere. Nothing happened since then until today. No activities, no follow-up mechanism, and a vision that is not implemented. I'll conclude by saying that the region is passing through all kinds of challenges. And we can go into these challenges in, some of them were mentioned by Mr. Biden, about the Sunni-Shia divide, the transition, the role of Islam in our societies. And we have all kinds of problems, both internal and external. And I can go into that into the discussion. But I think that the US needs to assess these challenges and decide on the role that it intends to play. Because our region will continue to be important to the United States for all kinds of reasons. I don't need to enumerate them. But unfortunately, the theme of this conference is our time to lead. And this is part of our problem in the region, the lack of leadership. And we have to admit that. Unfortunately, events are bigger than the men. And I will conclude by saying that I hope the US would reach the right assessment of the challenges facing our region and works on a coherent vision on the role that it can play, and that the approach would be an approach that is constructive and not prescriptive, and in a manner that is consistent with American principles and American values. Thank you.
Thank you, Hisham Youssef, for your insight. Thank you also, given that you represent 22 countries, you didn't go on for 22 minutes. I give the floor now to Mr. Tzachi Hanegbi, member of the Knesset.
Thank you. I gave up my time not because I'm very generous, but mainly because I am trying to be very cautious in this panel. When I was asked to participate, I felt a little bit uncomfortable because unlike other friends, David Miller was supposed to be here, or Tamara, or maybe a friend from the Arab League. I'm not a researcher or observant or objective journalist or commentator. I'm representing the state of Israel. I'm an elected official in the state of Israel, and my interests are not the American interests, and I don't have mandate from the American constituency to give advice to the American administration what to do and whether they have to use their limited or unlimited option in this way or another. So I will try to be as cautious as I can, but also to contribute something to this debate or to this discussion. But my time is up, so I'll do it later. Thank you.
A real politician, a real politician, yes. A real politician, absolutely.
Thank you very much, thank you. And before I go on to do a quick round of Q&A with the panel, just wanted to note that Mr. Aaron David Miller regrets he was unable to attend the panel with us today due to schedule changes. Now that you said that your time is up, let me renew it. I'll start with you. Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli prime minister, was here in DC a few weeks ago. And he said, given the changes that the Middle East is going through, he said that he looks at Egypt and he sees the situation being what it is there. And then he looks at Syria and he sees the situation being what it is there and elsewhere in the region. And he feels that Israel has never felt more secure in its 6 decades of existence as it feels now. Do you share that assessment? And whether you do or you do not, what does that mean for the United States in that part of the world?
I guess that what the former prime minister related to was the fact that the nature of the threat that Israel is facing is totally changing, because for many years, for decades, we were training our forces or building our military strategy to the danger of an attack of conventional armies from the land of our neighbors. Something that we witnessed in 1948, in 1967, and 1973. I don't mention 1956 because it was an Israeli initiative alongside with France and England. But this was the biggest existential threat that we were faced with. And thank God we have peace treaty with 2 of the states that we're neighboring, Egypt and Jordan, and it's working to our satisfaction, and it's something that is, of course, is reducing the threat. And also what's happening in Syria now makes it more comfortable for us to look at our border in the north, and to feel that at the moment we won't see Syrian armored division going up the Golan Heights or going down from the Golan Heights into the state of Israel. But Mr. Olmert is wrong if we look at the bigger picture of the Iranian nuclear capabilities that are being built up, at the danger of, if Iran will be at the end victorious and will have military nuclear capacity, it will immediately mean that the whole region will do the same, because Egypt won't be able to stay aside, and Turkey and Jordan and other states in the Gulf will immediately. Saudi Arabia, I'm sure, is already considering how to challenge such development. So it will, of course, bring instability to the region and will pose a threat also to us, because miscalculation, escalation, everything that can erupt will or might find us as a target. Not mentioning that such weapon can find its way to terrorist organizations that are being sponsored by Iran. But altogether, I think that the dimension of the threat is different, and I would like to share some of the optimism that Mr. Olmert shared when he was here.
Okay, I'm going to try and get the view from the Arab world in a minute, but let me come back to you, Tamara. Given what we've just heard, and given what you alluded to in your open remarks, in fact, you didn't allude to it, you mentioned it, the pivot towards Asia, and given this widespread perception in the Middle East, whether in the Arab world or in Israel, that US power may be receding, declining, when the Obama administration looks at this, what does it see in terms of the future of Israel and in terms of the future of its Arab allies?
Well, I think it's a great question. And, you know, if you look at the events of this summer, the crisis in Egypt, the chemical attack in Syria, and the demand in the region, as I see it, especially on Syria, for a stronger American leadership role in helping to unify a coalition of support behind the rebels in Syria and to deal with the challenge that conflict posed to the region. There was a demand that I think the White House felt severely to contemplate a new military intervention. Look where we have ended up. As a result of some tough decisions by this White House, a diplomatic initiative on Syria that may or may not succeed, an Iranian diplomatic initiative as a result of the elections there, which I think you can make a strong argument that the sanctions pressure significantly shifted Iranian politics and helped contribute to that electoral outcome. So that diplomatic initiative is now underway. It may or may not succeed. And the renewal of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, well, I think that we can talk about why Netanyahu made the decision to go back into talks, but I think we also have to ask, why did Abu Mazen choose to go back into talks? And one reason, I would suggest, is not only the issues related to the conflict itself, but also the issues related to the neighborhood. And the fact that Abu Mazen feels that he has today a stronger position relative to some of his political rivals after the coup in Egypt than he did before. So in some ways, these changes in the region, I think, have given a boost to diplomacy and have created opportunities for the Obama administration to re-engage in the region in a stronger way, in a firmer way, but through diplomacy. And it has made very clear that its desire is to deal with these issues through diplomacy. So I think that's the trajectory the president has set. The big question we face, of course, is what if diplomacy fails on any of these three fronts? And then I think the White House, again, is facing some really, really difficult choices. If you had asked me that question a few months ago, Abderrahim, I would have said that governments in the region were drawing the conclusion that the United States was pivoting to Asia. It was done. The U.S. was walking away, and they were making decisions on their own. I don't see that today. Again, I see people looking to Washington for leadership.
Does that remind you of that scene in The Godfather? Every time I want to get out, they pull
drag me back in. Yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised if the White House felt a bit that way. But look, this is a global superpower. It has global interests. This is a geostrategically crucial part of the world. So the United States is going to have interests in the Middle East that it needs to pursue. And the region is simply not in a place where it can maintain that regional order without American leadership.
Hisham, how counterintuitive do you think the Obama administration seems to be looked at through Arab and Israeli eyes? I mean, Mubarak was one of the pillars of the status quo in the Middle East. He's gone. Syria is in shambles, so is Iraq. And yet, the Obama administration has chosen this time, when the Arab region never looked more unstable, to want to push through with a Middle East process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Where's the logic in that?
Well, you should read the statement of Vice President Biden. He said the American rationale, why they think now is the right time. And as a matter of fact, I agree with him, that now is a good time. As a matter of fact, any time is a good time to resolve a crisis like the Palestinian crisis. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, there has been a lot of delay, day in and day out, for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it is we have an election in the United States. We have an election in Israel. We have a Congress change and so on. So we have always millions of excuses not to go to the negotiating table and to take the hard decisions. But then when we find an opportunity where Secretary Kerry was successful in something that I think the majority of those who are experts in the Middle East thought that he would not succeed. So when he succeeds, I can't blame him. As a matter of fact, we're extremely thankful for the kind of effort that he has done. But what needs to be done after that is much more difficult. And this is why, and I mentioned this this morning, I believe that it would not be possible to achieve the breakthrough that is required in negotiations without the personal intervention of the president to roll back his sleeves and start working with the Prime Minister of Israel and the Palestinian president in order to achieve this breakthrough.
On the issue of excuses, and I just want to do a quick follow-up before I open it up to Q&A. In the past, we heard the Israelis say, the Palestinians don't really want peace. They can come up with 1,000 different excuses. We heard the Palestinians say, the Israelis don't want peace. They can come up with 1,000 different excuses. Well, if Mubarak is gone, Syria is in shambles, so is Iraq and the rest of the region. That's not an excuse. That's a real handicap. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I don't want you to put the Palestinians and the Israelis on equal footing in relation to this issue, because the Palestinians have accepted every single offer to go to negotiations. Despite all the difficulties, they from Madrid to even having to go to Oslo, and all the negotiations that took place in the last 20 years, culminating even in the Annapolis Conference, and then after that, the effort of Mitchell, and then now with Secretary Kerry. Every single time the Palestinians were asked to go into negotiations, they said they had to oblige. They have no other choice. But the problem was always the difficulty on the other side, that Israel also always had its internal situation that sometimes prevented it from going back to the negotiating table for one reason or another. So I don't think that they can be equated.
All right. We have about exactly 15 minutes to the end of this panel, so I'm going to open it up for Q&A. What I have been instructed to do, as you heard from Stephen at the outset, is that the questions and comments will be written on a piece of paper, or for those sitting in the front row, you have a text message address which you can dial to get your questions and comments to the panelists. Thank you. Okay, the first question I have here, excuse me, I've got to put on my glasses. What about a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone? Do you think the Helsinki conference will be resumed? Why don't I start with you, Mr. Youssef? This may seem like inside baseball.
No, this question is addressed here. As far as we're concerned, we have no problem.
I'm not here.
So give me, pretend that he's not there, and I'll make him be there in a minute. Give me your take on this. What about a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone?
Absolutely. This is our position. We have been advocating for that for years. And we have been trying to do that. And unfortunately, one of the questions that should be asked in relation to the speech that we just heard is that what was mentioned was the possibility of Iran becoming a nuclear power and the chemical weapons of Syria, and it stopped there. As if there are no other weapons of mass destruction in the region. We have always been supportive of a region free from all weapons of mass destruction in any state. And we have always been against Iran becoming a military nuclear power. Absolutely, no doubt, no ands, ifs, or buts about this issue.
Tamara, let me come to you on this, and I'll give Mr. Hanegbi time to mull it over before I come to him. This issue, you know, it has been a subject of intense debate between the Arabs and the Israelis. Not necessarily just the governments, but also the populations. And a lot of Arabs would argue that if the Israelis are allowed to have weapons of mass destruction, why couldn't others, even the Iranians? And we hear this view even in the Gulf, where the animus towards the Iranian government seems to be at its apex. What sort of challenge does this pose for the Obama administration in terms of, you know, perception is reality sometimes?
Well, look, I think there are a couple issues. I mean, first, it's just a matter of political realism that the more the world and the region focuses on chemical weapons in Syria and the potential for nuclear weapons in Iran, that WMD in the region more broadly is going to become a focus of discussion. And I think Israel needs to be prepared for that discussion. And this has happened in the past. So it's not a surprise to anybody. And I think, but the other thing I would say is that I think it matters very much to contributing factors, if you will, to how WMD are perceived and how much of a threat they present to regional security and to international peace and security. The Syrian regime has used chemical weapons. It has used chemical weapons against its own civilian population. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons in an interstate war and used them as well against his own civilian population. So you have to, you're not only making a judgment about the nature of the weapon itself, you have to make judgments about the nature of the regime. And as is very clear in US policy, the concern with Iran is not only a concern about its nuclear program, it's also a concern about its sponsorship of international terrorism. It's also a concern about the role that it's played creating instability around the region. So I don't think that it's appropriate to focus just on a weapon. A weapon is a tool. And this takes me to the broader point, which is the last time this region had a really significant conversation about this issue was during the during the Madrid framework, when we had the multilateral ACRS talks, the Arms Control and Regional Security talks. And that brought together the countries of the region with international partners under the umbrella of the Madrid peace process to work through these issues, not about specific weapons, you know, are missiles the strategic threat, are chemicals the strategic threat, but to talk about regional security and what it takes so that governments don't feel the need to develop any of these strategic threats.
Tzachi, Hanegbi, for peace sake, be there and give you something to work with on this?
Well, I think that Tamara was right. Israel has to prepare to this discussion. I'm not prepared yet, so I must prepare. In the meantime, we'll go on growing oranges and olives. But you relate to this issue if I want to go back safely.
Okay. Comment requested on challenges. I'm taking these questions and comments in the order I received them, by the way. Comments requested on challenges posed by the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers from the Golan Heights.
Thank you. It's a problem that we're trying to solve by bringing in back peacekeeping forces. United Nations is committed to fulfill the place of those that left. This peacekeeping force proved himself very important and efficient for the last since 1973, 74, and it definitely should come back in the light of what's happening in the Golan Heights. If you have the chance of coming to Israel and visiting the Golan Heights, and you physically see the fights between the rebels and Assad's army, and you hear the voices, you see the smoke, and many people that got wounded, sometimes critically wounded, are being brought to the border and are being treated in our hospitals. There's more than 100 people already. We don't know if they are rebels or no rebels, if they are Assad supporters or not, but we try immediately to save them, and many of them, all of them were saved besides one, unfortunately, that I think died on the surgery table. But I hope that this force will be reestablished and will serve its duty and will help to both countries, and especially the citizens of both countries.
Okay. Now, I have a question, and it says here specifically to all panelists. Do you see any correlation between the softening of the U.S. stance on regime change in Syria with developments on the Iranian nuclear issue? Who wants to start? Tamara.
You know, I'm not sure that there's been a softening when you get into the details of the Geneva effort. I think that while there's an agreement on the Geneva framework that says that the interim authority, the transitional authority in Syria, must be agreed to by all parties, the United States has made clear that it holds the view that it's inconceivable that Bashar al-Assad would continue in that capacity. And if it's subject to mutual consent, it's frankly inconceivable that the rebel factions that would come to Geneva would consent to have Assad remain. So I think in practice, it is still a strategy that says Bashar al-Assad has demonstrated his unfitness for leadership in Syria.
Since we're on the subject of Syria, let me drag the Arab League into it again. We have a question which says, I believe it is inevitable that Syria will be partitioned along sectarian lines. Do you agree?
No. No, seriously. It is a concern. It's a concern by many. And as a matter of fact, we had this concern also a few years ago with Iraq, when people were afraid that Iraq also may be fragmented. But I don't think that it would reach this situation. I hope not. And I think that it is not in the interest neither of the Syrian people nor of the region as a whole. And I think that there would be many forces in the region and beyond the region that will try to ensure that the crisis in Syria is resolved while maintaining its unity.
With I've only got a few minutes left. In fact, exactly according to my watch, I've got exactly 4 minutes left to the end of this session. With the US relying far less on Middle East oil, what is the case for the US having strong geopolitical interest in the area? I guess this bounces you back to the issue of the pivot.
Right.
You want to take it?
Sure, I'll take it very briefly, which is I think there are a couple major factors. One is that while the United States may not itself import oil from the region, it's a global market. And the price of oil globally is going to be affected, including the price of domestically produced. The other thing, of course, is that the United States has a stake, a huge stake, in the stability of the global economy, including its largest economic partners in Europe who are still dependent on Middle Eastern oil and gas. So, and then, of course, if the United States wants to remain, and I do believe it wants to remain, a global superpower, it needs to maintain its core interests in the stability and security of this global crossroads. The openness of the Suez Canal to international commerce, the free flow of energy out of the Gulf, these are fundamentals of international peace and security.
Finally, I think, how do you feel a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will affect other conflicts in the Middle East? And whoever wrote the question included the specific examples of Syria, which we've already talked about, Iraq, Iran, which we've already talked about, Sunni Shia, which Joe Biden already talked about, and Egypt. And since we have somebody who's both Arab League and Egyptian, what do you think?
How will the Palestinian question affect all these issues?
How a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will affect all these other issues?
You see, when the Arab world kept saying that the Palestinian question is the core conflict in this part of the world, people used to make fun of us. And with all the problems that we have today, perhaps they're justified. But we still believe in that. And if you go back to some of the testimony in Congress by American officials, they would tell you, I think it's General Petraeus who went to Congress at one point in time, and he told them, while I was in Iraq, I was surprised every single home that I entered, I found a picture of the Dome of the Rock. And I was really surprised. Why would Iraqis be that interested in a mosque that is thousands of kilometers away? And he said that at that point he realized that things are connected in the Middle East. Absolutely. And then the issue of the Sunni-Shia divide. I think that this is one of the issues that is going to plague the region, unfortunately, for decades to come. This is a problem that is affecting a large number of countries in our part of the world. And we haven't even started to discuss how this issue can be addressed. Whether it's regarding the situation in Iraq, despite what was mentioned that the situation in Iraq is improving, yes, it is marginally improving, but it goes back and forth. One step forward, two steps back. And this applies also to the situation in other places, in Lebanon, in Yemen, between the Houthis and so on. So this issue, I think, would be one of the most difficult problems in the years to come. But resolving the Palestinian question will have a huge impact on the region as a whole. And I think it will transform this region beyond our belief. And this is why our hope was that Israel would see this matter in this context and not in the context of trying to maximize what it can gain from a weak Palestinian partner, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, the end
I just want to agree.
Of course. Unfortunately, the end is nigh. That's not a messianic message. The end is nigh for this session. Thank you very much to our panelists, Tamara Cofman Wittes, Hisham Youssef, and Tzachi Hanegbi. Thank you all for your attention, questions, and comments.